When monsters die, where do they go? In Baltimore, they don't just disappear, they end up in a museum. Today was my first day working as an assistant at the Baltimore Earth Sciences Museum. It's a prestigious position, one that puts me under the guidance of none other than Dr. Jackson, widely regarded as the greatest cryptozoologist in the world. Unlike most cryptid hunters who spend their lives chasing shadows in the woods, we have something they don't. We have proof. But getting this job wasn't easy. It wasn't something you could just apply for. To work with Dr. Mortimer Jackson, you had to be chosen. And he didn't choose just anyone. If you wanted a place at his side, you needed experience in the kind of work he was interested in. The kind of work most people don't even believe exists. I knew exactly what I had to do. I enrolled at the university where he taught, meticulously planning my schedule to transfer into his courses. I wrote research papers referencing obscure articles that most would dismiss as fiction. I cited experts whose work had been buried, names that only someone deeply involved in his controversial field would recognize. And when I finally got the opportunity to speak with him in private, I showed him something I had been keeping hidden for 15 years. The moment he watched the footage I handed him, I saw the shift in his expression. He knew. He recognized it as real, undeniable. And in that instant, he understood that I knew too. That I wasn't just another hopeful student chasing myths. I was already in the thick of it. I was just as dedicated to uncovering the truth as he was. He didn't say much then, but a week later, he made me an offer. The moment he mentioned the job, I accepted without hesitation. Dr. Jackson greeted me at the museum, leading me past the carefully arranged exhibits, beyond the displays meant for public viewing. "You've got drive, Nick." "I like that," he said, casting me an approving glance. "Reminds me of myself when I was younger." His official title was Professor of Biology at the University of Baltimore. In that capacity, he was well respected, recognized primarily for his work in zoology. These days, however, his focus had shifted. He spent most of his time teaching and working within the museum. "To be honest, sir," I admitted, "I just want to understand what's really out there. I've been trying to for years." The scars on my body could attest to that. Most people didn't realize how often cryptids were spotted just beyond barbed wire fences, always in places no one was supposed to go. "So do I," he said, then added with a small smile, "And please, just call me Morty." He led me toward an elevator at the far end of the hallway, scanning a key card before the doors slid open. "You're a bright young man," he continued as we stepped inside. "Exactly how much do you know about our other work down here?" His tone shifted, becoming heavier, more deliberate. "Not much," I admitted. "I know you've got a strong interest in cryptids, and I've heard rumors." "Rumors?" he echoed, pressing a button that sent us descending into the depths of the building. I hesitated for a moment before speaking. "About proof," I said carefully. The way his eyes gleamed at that word sent a thrill through me. "Proof?" he mused, tilting his head slightly. I blinked. "Wait, that can't be true, right? You don't actually have them?" My stomach flipped at the mere suggestion of what that could mean. He smiled knowingly. "Specimens?" he asked, voice tinged with amusement. "Oh, we have them. Several, in fact." My pulse quickened. My breath hitched, and as the elevator doors finally slid open, he turned to me with an almost playful glint in his eye. "You want to see one?" I didn't even have to think. "Yes," I said instantly. I couldn't have answered fast enough. At first glance, the basement of the museum looked ordinary. The floors were lined with spotless linoleum, the walls were painted in dull beige, and the overhead fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over everything. It had the same generic atmosphere as any office space. But unlike the bustling exhibits upstairs, the basement was unnervingly silent. I couldn't help but wonder if Dr. Jackson and I were the only ones down here. "You know, when I first started working here, I never imagined I'd get the chance to study these creatures firsthand," he said, his voice carrying a weight that hinted at years of hidden knowledge. I listened intently as we walked. "I've always kept an open mind about the unknown," he continued. "But I also balanced that with a fair amount of skepticism. That is, until about 10 years ago, when we encountered our first specimen. From that moment on, everything changed." His words sent a chill through me. "Where did you find it?" I asked, eager to know more. Dr. Jackson let out a small chuckle. "It's actually a funny story. A local coroner brought it to our attention. It was discovered during a search and rescue mission. A hiker had gone missing in the woods, and when the team went looking for him, well, they found something else instead. At first, they thought it was human, but the closer they examined it, the more they realized it wasn't, not even close. So they reached out to us to help determine exactly what it was. He led me through a door, and suddenly I found myself in a room that bore a striking resemblance to a morgue. My stomach tensed as I took in the sight before me. The space was filled with a wall of specimen cabinets, large, metal compartments locked away behind glass. The sheer number of them made me pause. Just how many of these creatures had they found? Without a word, Dr. Jackson slipped on a pair of gloves and approached the cabinets. He pulled out a key, unlocked one of them, and then carefully opened a drawer. He selected one of the larger compartments and slid it open with deliberate care, almost as if he were handling something sacred. Inside, laid out meticulously, were bones, pale white and arranged to form the skeleton of something that, at first glance, seemed human. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became that it wasn't. Not entirely. The proportions were wrong. The bones were larger than any human skeleton should be. The skull was completely alien, an unsettling fusion of a gorilla and a feline. Its jaw was slightly elongated, and its eye sockets were wider, giving it a face that seemed almost built to instill fear. I stood frozen, staring in stunned silence. For years, the only proof I'd ever had of these creatures had been the grainy footage I'd shown Dr. Jackson, the same footage I had captured on my phone the night of the accident, the night my sister died. But now, here it was. Unmistakable, unquestionable, real bones, a real skeleton. My mind raced. My entire life, I had searched for validation, for confirmation that what I had seen that night wasn't just a trick of the mind. And now, I was standing in front of proof so tangible, so undeniable, that it left me breathless. A single thought wormed its way into my head, one that I hadn't considered before. If this thing had died, what had been capable of killing it? Dr. Jackson must have seen the way my expression shifted, because he smirked knowingly. "Incredible, isn't it?" he said, his voice tinged with both awe and satisfaction. I swallowed hard, trying to process what I was looking at. "When we first examined it," he continued, "it became obvious almost immediately that it didn't match any known species. Every test, every analysis, every comparison, we ruled out everything, which left us with only one possible conclusion. This wasn't an undiscovered animal. It was an entirely new form of life." "You've had this for 10 years?" I whispered, barely able to comprehend what that meant. "You've had a body for 10 years, and you never published any of this." Dr. Jackson turned to me, his expression unreadable. Then, with unsettling calm, he corrected me. "Bodies," he said, "plural." I blinked. "We've identified about 15 distinct species so far," he continued, his voice measured. "Some closer to human than others. Close enough that if you passed one on the street, you wouldn't even know what you were looking at." My skin prickled. "That's actually part of why we've been hesitant to go public with our findings," he admitted. "The ones that resemble us the most, those are the ones we fear the most." I felt my breath catch. "They didn't just evolve to look like us by accident," he said, his tone grave. "If our theory is correct, they did it for a reason." His gaze met mine, and in that moment, I understood exactly what he meant. "They evolved to hunt us," he said, "to blend in, to feed." He moved to another drawer, hesitating only for a moment before pulling it open. Inside was a collection of skulls. At first glance, most of them looked human, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. The teeth. They were too long, unnaturally sharp, as if designed for tearing flesh rather than chewing food. The sight sent a chill through me. "Revealing the existence of these creatures could be dangerous in more ways than one," Dr. Jackson said, his voice calm but firm. "At best, we'd turn ourselves into the subject of ridicule. Even if we presented undeniable evidence, the scientific community wouldn't accept it immediately. They'd demand extensive investigation, and while they were busy doing that, we'd be making ourselves targets." His words made my stomach tighten. "I doubt these creatures would be thrilled about being exposed," he went on. "They've spent who knows how long staying hidden, and then there's the other side of it, the question of what would happen to them if the truth came out." He paused, studying the skulls as if weighing every possibility. From what we've gathered, they're rare, he continued. These bodies don't turn up often, which suggests their numbers are low. Their survival depends on people not knowing they exist. If that changes, they could be wiped out entirely. His fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the drawer before he let out a short, humorless chuckle. People can be, well, let's just say they're not always rational. Tell the world that monsters are real, and a good portion of the population will take that as an invitation to start hunting them down. Witch hunts never really went away. They just evolved. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Yes, these creatures were dangerous. But the thought of them being completely eradicated before we had the chance to truly study them? Before we even understood what they were, where they came from, and what role they played in the world? That felt like a loss. A waste of something unknown, something that could change everything we thought we understood about life itself. Dr. Jackson stared at the skulls a moment longer, lost in thought, before he finally closed the drawer with a soft click. "Apologies," he said, shaking his head slightly. "I tend to ramble." I said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "The point is," he said, meeting my gaze, "there's too much at stake to rush this. A while back, the team and I agreed it was best to keep our research private, to learn as much as we can before making any decisions. If we're ever going to reveal this to the world, we need to be absolutely sure of what we're dealing with." I hesitated, then asked the question that had been weighing on my mind since I first saw the skeleton. "Have you ever encountered one that's still alive?" Dr. Jackson's lips pressed into a thin line before he answered. "Not yet," he admitted, "but I've always hoped that one day we would." With that, he turned, moving back toward the first specimen and carefully locking the cabinet once more. His movements were methodical, deliberate, as if sealing away something far more valuable than just bones. "Come along," he said, glancing back at me. "I should show you where you'll be working." I nodded and followed him without hesitation. The rest of the day was significantly less eventful. I met another member of the team, one of the few working in this small, secretive part of the museum. Her name was Heidi. She was another assistant archivist working under one of Dr. Jackson's colleagues. I'd be spending most of my time with her, considering that Dr. Jackson and the senior researchers were often preoccupied with their own work. She seemed friendly enough. There was something familiar about her, something that reminded me of Marcia. Maybe it was the way she wore her dirty blonde hair, a little messy but effortlessly put together. Or maybe it was her oversized sweater, cozy and slightly worn, like something that had been her favorite for years. My sister used to have a sweater just like that. But there was something about Heidi that struck me as no nonsense. She wasn't one for idle chatter. Every conversation we had was straight to the point. The longest exchange between us happened when she walked me through the emergency security protocols. "It's simple," she said. "If there's ever an emergency, you can trigger a lockdown right from your laptop. All it really does is disable the elevator, lock the fire exit, and alert the police." Her tone was casual, as if she didn't expect I'd ever need to use it. "Have there been a lot of emergencies?" I asked, more out of curiosity than concern. "Nope," she replied, shaking her head. "But Dr. Jackson wanted to be prepared just in case. He made sure we had a system in place, even pulled some strings to get a couple of officers in the know, ready to respond if anything ever happened. But I've been working here for over a year, and so far, nothing." That was somewhat reassuring. When Dr. Jackson left in the middle of the day for his classes, I was left in Heidi's company. She was the one who showed me the more technical aspects of my job, the details that didn't involve staring at ancient bones. She taught me how to examine the evidence we received, how to categorize it, and how to file reports for Dr. Jackson and his colleagues. I'll be honest, it wasn't as thrilling as standing in front of something that once belonged to a creature beyond human understanding. But there was something gratifying about it. Sorting through evidence of their existence felt like I was part of something important, like I was helping uncover the truth. It felt validating. For 15 years, I had been chasing an answer to the same question, trying to understand what really happened that night. I combed through every piece of information, comparing it to the notes I had kept for so long. Slowly, I started piecing things together, but no amount of research could change the nightmares. Even now, I still dream about the accident. I was only 12 when it happened. My family had gone on a short vacation to a cabin up north. It wasn't anything fancy, just a quiet getaway. I had just gotten my first cell phone, and most of my time had been spent playing around with it. Taking photos, recording videos. Not because there was anything particularly interesting to capture, but simply because I could. I still have most of those pictures, most of those videos. That Sunday, we were supposed to head home early, but the car battery died before we could leave. Dad had to get it towed to a garage. By the time we were back on the road, the sun had already started to set. Night had fully settled by the time we were deep in the middle of nowhere. The trees that lined the back roads had vanished into the darkness. Outside the car windows, there was nothing but an empty black void stretching in every direction. I remember Mom suggesting that we stop at a motel for the night. She didn't like the idea of driving through unfamiliar roads in the dark. She thought it was too dangerous. But Dad, ever stubborn, insisted we were fine. Then we hit the deer. I wasn't even paying attention at the time. I was too busy filming myself annoying my sister Marcia. I was bored, and bugging her was something to do. I had the camera pointed at her, recording her reactions, when everything suddenly went wrong. You can't see the deer in the footage, but you can hear my mom scream. Then everything blurs as the phone is tossed from my hands. The video doesn't show what happened next. But I remember, Dad tried to swerve, but we were going too fast. The car still clipped the deer before skidding off the road entirely. The tires lost traction, and suddenly we were rolling, tumbling. The world spinning in a blur of motion and noise. Then, silence. In the recording, you can hear my dad moving first. His voice is groggy, disoriented, asking if everyone is all right. Then comes the sound of him struggling to get out of the car. The sound of him getting to me and Marcia. The video picks up again about 10 minutes later. I must have reached for my phone without thinking. By then, my dad was helping me out of the wreckage. The footage is too dark to make anything out clearly. The forest around us is nothing but shadows. The only thing the camera manages to capture is the stretch of trees barely illuminated by the fading glow of the headlights. But the audio tells the real story. You can hear my family trying to gather themselves, their voices filled with shock and confusion. You can hear my mother frantically calling for help, her voice trembling. And then underneath it all, you can hear something moving in the trees, something creeping closer. At some point, I became aware that my camera was still recording. Without thinking, I started filming the aftermath of the crash. I can't really say why. I don't remember what compelled me to do it. But in the footage, you can clearly see Marcia and the rest of my family standing in the glow of the headlights. You can hear my mom speaking urgently into her phone, trying to get help. And beneath her voice, there's another sound, a dull, heavy thud from somewhere just beyond the trees, something moving closer. Marcia notices it first. You can see the exact moment she realizes that we weren't alone, that something had followed us down the embankment. Her expression shifts in an instant, her face contorting into pure, unfiltered terror. It's the kind of fear that doesn't leave room for thought, only instinct. She stumbles back with a shriek, her panic spreading like wildfire. My mom's scream follows, then my dad's. And then I saw it too. It was little more than a silhouette against the night, a towering, impossibly thin figure, humanoid, yet unmistakably wrong. It was difficult to make out its exact shape, like its form was shifting, refusing to be clearly defined. But I could see its eyes, burning through the darkness. Twin points of eerie, unnatural light. I remember turning my camera towards it, and for a brief, shaky moment, the lens captured those eyes. Two glowing embers, fixed directly on us. A heartbeat later, it let out a horrible hissing sound and lunged forward. That was when everything fell apart. My dad was closest to my mom, and he grabbed her, yanking her backward in a desperate attempt to get her away. His voice was hoarse and frantic, shouting my name, Marcia's name, ordering us to run. The camera caught the blur of Marcia as she turned and bolted into the trees, and just behind her, you can see the creature move. For only a few seconds, it's visible. A pale, elongated shape with unnervingly long limbs. Its movement was unnatural, jerky, yet impossibly fast. The headlights illuminated it just enough for a handful of frames before it disappeared, vanishing into the dark as it pursued my sister. That was the last clear image captured. I wasn't even thinking about recording anymore. The camera became an afterthought, jostled and turned away as I ran. The screen went dark, but the sound continued. The heavy crunch of my footsteps, my breath, ragged and gasping. And cutting through it all, Marcia's screams. She screamed for our parents, screamed in terror, in agony. Her voice carried through the night, high, raw, desperate. And then, all at once, it stopped. The recording continued for a few minutes more, catching nothing but my unsteady breathing before the camera's storage filled up, and the footage ended. But in my mind, the scene never stopped playing. Even now, I can still hear her. The way she cried, the way she begged. The police found her body about 20 feet from where we crashed. Their official conclusion? A bear attack. They claimed a bear must have wandered close to investigate the wreck, then gone after Marcia when she ran. It was an explanation that, eventually, my parents accepted. I never did. I can't forgive them for that. We all saw it. We all knew the truth, but they wanted to forget, to erase it from their minds. I refused. I made them watch the footage over and over, forced them to focus on those frames that proved we weren't imagining things. I pushed them until they snapped, threatening to destroy my phone just to make me stop. That was when I knew I was on my own. I didn't know what that thing was, but I needed to find out. I needed to understand. Hatred felt pointless. What would be the use of resenting it? If I spent my life hating it, I'd never get anywhere. But learning about it, studying it, finding out everything I could, that seemed like a far better use of my time. If I could just make sense of this thing, understand what it really was, then maybe my sister's death wouldn't feel so meaningless. I knew nothing would bring Marcia back, but that creature was still out there somewhere. It still existed. And I had to admit, dedicating myself to this search, to uncovering the truth, gave me a purpose I hadn't felt in years. For days, I worked nonstop, moving every bit of my personal research from my cramped dorm room into the museum's archives. Box after box, I carried over stacks of books, carefully marked maps, printed articles, and old case files. When I wasn't sorting through the mountain of samples that people mailed in, I spent every spare moment poring over the museum's collection, examining as many of the specimens as possible. Most of what we received was useless. Hoaxes, deliberate or not. Misidentified roadkill. Mangy animals mistaken for something supernatural. Sometimes people sent in blurry, low-quality photos of a shape in the distance, something barely visible, just enough to let the imagination take over. But hidden beneath all the fabricated stories and misguided assumptions, there were rare finds. A handful of real images, a few genuine videos, and among them, I found something that made my breath catch in my throat. A creature. Several, actually. Things that looked disturbingly similar to what I had seen that night, the night Marcia was taken. After all these years, for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And then something happened that changed everything. Heidi mentioned, almost offhandedly, that we were getting a new specimen soon. A fresh one. A pair of hunters had shot it earlier that afternoon, then contacted one of Dr. Jackson's colleagues, Dr. Verne. She said they'd already sent over some photos. I couldn't get to them fast enough. The moment I saw the pictures, my stomach twisted. It was hard to say for certain, but the thing they had killed, it looked eerily close to the creature I saw in the woods that night, the one that had taken my sister. This wasn't just another skeleton. This wasn't just a pile of old, brittle bones. This time, we were getting something far more intact. If there was ever an autopsy I wished I could be part of, this was it. A few days later, the body arrived. Seeing it in person, seeing it lying there on the examination table, was something I'll never forget. No amount of photographs, no amount of grainy footage or half-decayed remains could ever truly capture just how wrong these creatures were. And worse than that, the unmistakable evidence of what they used to be. Keyword, used to be. I couldn't say with certainty if it still counted as human. Maybe it had once, long ago. But now? Now, it was something else. At first glance, it still had the general shape of a person. But the longer I looked, the more I saw just how warped it truly was. Its skin was sickly pale, stretched too tight in some areas, while sagging loose in others. The proportions of its limbs were unsettling. Too long, too thin. Its arms should have looked fragile, but instead they were packed with wiry corded muscle beneath the skin. Its hands weren't hands anymore. The fingers had been gnawed down to the bone at the tips, worn away until they formed jagged, sharpened points. Claws, more than fingers. And then there was the face. At a glance, it still resembled a human skull, but only just. The eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, small and beady, lifeless. The lips were torn, jagged and uneven, as though it had shredded its own mouth over time. As if its only priority was to carve its face into something better suited for consuming flesh. Because that was what it was. A creature made for eating. Its teeth were still human, at least what remained of them. But there, between the yellowed enamel, were dark, rotting fragments of something. Flesh, meat, pieces of whatever it had fed on last. Looking at it, I knew exactly what it was, and worse than that, I knew what it had done. The sight of the thing made my stomach churn. A wave of nausea hit me as Marcia's screams echoed in my mind, but I shoved the memory away before it could take hold. I tore my gaze from the body, trying to focus on something else. Anything else. My eyes landed on the notes resting beside the corpse. Heidi had left them for me to review, neatly stacked on the table. Taking a steadying breath, I reached for them. According to the report, the creature had been shot by two local hunters, brothers named Adam and Joey Winslow. They had included a brief statement describing the events leading up to the kill. That morning, the Winslows had set out on what they assumed would be a typical hunting trip. Joey had spotted a buck and fired. His shot hit, but not well enough to bring the animal down immediately. The wounded deer took off into the trees, and the brothers followed, assuming they would find it collapsed not far from where it had been struck. But something else had gotten to it first. When they finally caught up, the buck was already on the ground. The creature was crouched over it, its jagged teeth buried deep in the deer's throat. Blood pooled beneath the carcass as the thing clamped down, refusing to let go. It was trying to drag the body away. The brothers swore that as soon as it noticed them, the thing let out a low, animalistic hiss. It locked eyes with them, its body coiling as if preparing to lunge. They didn't wait for it to make the first move. They raised their rifles and opened fire. Even after the first few shots landed, the thing kept twitching. It convulsed violently, refusing to go down. It took 3 more rounds before it finally collapsed, but even then, the brothers hesitated. They swore up and down, that even after those final shots, the thing still might have been alive. I found that hard to believe. No creature on Earth should have been able to take that much damage and keep breathing. Still, as I looked down at the bullet-riddled body lying before me, I felt a strange unease settle over me. My gaze drifted to its chest. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw it move. No, that wasn't possible. It had to be a trick of the light, a flicker of my own exhaustion playing games with me. There was no way this thing was still alive. Not after everything it had been through. 3 rifle rounds to the skull alone should have been enough to make sure of that. I figured I'd have my answers soon enough. Dr. Jackson and Dr. Verne were scheduled to examine the body later that evening. Heidi had mentioned that they planned to conduct a full autopsy, and I would have given anything to sit in on it. But I was still a student, and school didn't wait for monsters. I had assignments to finish, deadlines to meet. Still, I was eager to know what they would find. With any luck, I'd get the details by morning. Dr. Jackson and Dr. Verne typically recorded their autopsies, and if I played my cards right, I might even be able to get my hands on a copy of the video. The next morning, I arrived at the museum early, eager to review their findings. But the moment I stepped into the examination room, my stomach dropped. The specimen was gone. The metal table where we had left it was empty, save for the dark, drying blood that still stained its surface. More blood had pooled on the floor beneath it. Had they forgotten to clean up after the autopsy? That didn't seem like them. Frowning, I turned to Heidi. She was already at her desk, fingers flying over her keyboard as she typed. I made a beeline for the notes. Dr. Jackson and Dr. Verne always left some kind of written report after an examination. But as I rifled through the usual stack of paperwork, I found nothing. Puzzled, I turned to Heidi. "Hey, do you know if they already filed away the autopsy notes?" I asked. She barely glanced up. "If they're not in the room, they might have emailed them to you," she said. I immediately opened my laptop and pulled up my inbox, but as I scrolled through my messages, I found nothing. Not a single email from either of them. "Nope," I muttered. "Nothing here." I hesitated for a beat before asking the next question. "Do you know what room they moved the specimen to? I'll check there." The moment the words left my mouth, Heidi froze. I watched as her fingers went still against the keyboard, her brow furrowing in confusion. I could practically see the gears in her head turning as she slowly turned to face me. "What do you mean they moved the specimen?" she asked, her voice careful, measured. I blinked. "Well, it wasn't in the room," I said, gesturing toward the empty table. For a single, stretched-out second, she just stared at me. Then, without another word, she shoved back her chair and bolted. I barely had time to react before she was already halfway down the hall, heading straight for the examination room. I hurried after her, my pulse spiking as she threw open the door. She stepped inside and went completely still, her gaze locked onto the blood-soaked table. She didn't say a word. I watched as the color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and stricken. "They had to have moved it," I insisted, my voice rising slightly. "That thing was dead, Heidi. You saw it with your own eyes. It was dead." But she didn't answer. She just stood there, silent and rigid, her mind struggling to process what was right in front of her. Then, as if snapping out of it, she suddenly took off, darting toward the nearest examination room. She shoved the door open, took a quick look inside, then moved on. One by one, she checked all 6 of them. Every last one was empty. The specimen was gone. But that wasn't possible. That thing had been riddled with bullets, including 3 straight to the head. There was no logical explanation for it to be missing. It was dead. It had to be dead. I had seen it myself. There was no way something could take that kind of damage and still get up, let alone just disappear. That kind of thing just wasn't supposed to happen. And yet, the moment Heidi realized the rooms were empty, she bolted back toward the office, moving so fast I barely had time to react. She was already pulling out her phone as she ran, her fingers trembling as she dialed Dr. Jackson's number. I followed close behind, making sure to lock the door behind us the second we got inside. The room felt oppressively silent as she paced anxiously, waiting for the call to connect. Then, after a few moments, the sound of his phone ringing echoed faintly through the halls. Heidi and I froze. Our eyes met, and in that split second, we both understood the horrifying implication of what we were hearing. Slowly, her gaze lifted toward the ceiling, her breaths coming quicker, more erratic. The ringing wasn't coming from somewhere else in the building. It was coming from above us. She stared at the ceiling tiles, her hands curling into fists at her sides as though steadying herself. "Shut down the elevator," she whispered, her voice so low and shaken it was almost hard to hear. Then, more urgently, she snapped, "Shut down the elevator right now." My stomach twisted into knots as I rushed to my computer, fingers fumbling over the keyboard as I pulled up the security system. My pulse hammered in my ears while I clicked through the options as fast as I could. A notification flashed across the screen, elevator deactivated, fire exit locked. I exhaled sharply, barely catching my breath before glancing over at Heidi. She was already halfway across the room, her hands moving with desperate urgency as she flung open a cabinet on the far wall. I stepped closer just in time to see her pull out a small metal box. "What's that?" I asked, though something in my gut already knew. She didn't answer, but I got my response soon enough when she lifted the lid, revealing a revolver nestled inside. My chest tightened. I shouldn't have been surprised. Dr. Jackson had always been more paranoid than he let on, and now I understood why. Heidi's hands shook as she gripped the gun, struggling to open the cylinder to load it. After a few failed attempts, I reached out, gently taking it from her and doing it myself. She just stared at me, wide-eyed, her breathing uneven, her face a mask of barely restrained fear. Once the gun was ready, I swallowed hard and glanced up toward the ceiling again. The ringing from Dr. Jackson's phone still echoed faintly above us. Heidi shifted uncomfortably beside me, gripping the revolver tighter. "Do you think it's up there?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer. I hesitated, my thoughts racing. A part of me considered firing a shot straight into the ceiling tiles, just to see what happened. If something was up there, maybe it would scare it off. Or maybe it would do the exact opposite. Maybe it would provoke it. I squeezed my eyes shut, and without warning, Marcia's screams tore through my memory like a blade. The sound of her terror, the helplessness in her voice, I could hear it so clearly as if it had just happened. And for a brief, horrifying second, I imagined Heidi screaming that same way. I didn't know her well. Not really. But that didn't matter. I didn't want her to die. I had always been willing to risk everything for my research. But this wasn't just my risk to take. I couldn't gamble with someone else's life. No, I wouldn't let her die like that. I wouldn't let either of us die like that. Not after coming this far. I inhaled deeply, steadying myself, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed sharply through the room. Heidi flinched, letting out a startled yelp as the bullet tore into the ceiling. Her wide eyes darted upward as the ringing from Dr. Jackson's phone abruptly stopped. For a brief moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no sign that anything had been up there at all. The silence was thick, stretching on, broken only by Heidi's uneven, trembling breaths. I kept my gaze fixed on the ceiling, my grip still tight around the gun. Then, without hesitation, I grabbed a nearby chair and dragged it directly underneath one of the ceiling tiles. "What the hell are you doing?" Heidi demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to check," I muttered. The more I thought about it, the more I struggled to believe that the creature had just been sitting there, unmoving, while a gunshot blasted through the ceiling beneath it. If it was really up there, it should have reacted in some way. That meant one of two things. It had already moved, or it was never there to begin with. Either way, I needed to know. Bracing myself, I climbed onto the chair, my muscles tensing as I reached for the nearest ceiling tile. I hesitated for just a second before carefully lifting it, my pulse hammering in my ears. Below me, Heidi stood stiffly, her fingers curled into anxious fists as she watched me intently. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light in the crawlspace above, I caught sight of something. A shape. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, but I forced myself to stay still, gripping the gun so tightly that my knuckles ached. The shape didn't move. With slow, deliberate movements, I reached into my pocket and fumbled for my phone. The moment my fingers found it, I flipped on the flashlight and directed the beam into the darkness. The light cut through the shadows, and I felt my stomach drop. Dr. Mortimer Jackson stared back at me with wide, unseeing eyes, or at least what was left of him. His body was twisted unnaturally, crammed into the cramped space like a discarded rag doll. Beside him, another corpse, Dr. Verne. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. My entire body went cold. The creature had hidden the bodies. The realization made my skin crawl, but beneath the horror, I felt something else. A dark, unsettling admiration. This thing wasn't just dangerous, it was intelligent. It had planned this. The chair beneath me wobbled suddenly, snapping me out of my trance. I recoiled from the crawlspace, nearly losing my balance as I stumbled off the chair and hit the floor. Heidi took one look at my face and paled. I didn't have to say anything, she already knew. Her gaze flickered up to the ceiling, and I saw the moment she made the decision not to look. She didn't need to see what I had just seen. Some things were better left unseen. "Did you see it?" she asked, her voice hushed, almost hopeful. I exhaled slowly and shook my head. No, if it's still up there, it's nowhere near us now. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We sat there in heavy silence, ears straining for any sound, any sign that the creature was still lurking nearby. But there was nothing. Nothing until Heidi's phone rang. The sharp tone shattered the quiet, making both of us jump. She fumbled for her phone, staring down at the screen. Then relief washed over her face. "The police," she breathed. We stayed put as the officers arrived and began their search. We heard their voices echo through the halls, the shuffle of footsteps moving from room to room. But in the end, they found nothing. Nothing but the bodies, the ones crammed above the ceiling tiles. The two joggers who had been found torn apart near the museum. That was it. No sign of the creature. No trace of where it had gone. And I realized something that sent a fresh wave of unease through me. There was only one thing worse than being trapped in a museum basement with a monster. Being trapped in a museum basement without one. Heidi and I gave our statements to the police, recounting everything that had happened. Afterward, she made a decision. I could see it in her face before she even spoke. She wasn't coming back, at least not anytime soon. Instead, she told me she was going to stay with a friend. I didn't blame her. As for me, I went home, but not to sleep, not to forget. I went to get the things I'd need, because this wasn't over. I had started looking into the police reports. Strange animal attacks, hikers found torn apart, massive claw marks that didn't match anything native to this area. Tracks too big to be from a bear, too unnatural to be from any known predator. The more I read, the clearer it became. This creature wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something bigger. And since we lost our only live specimen, well, it only made sense for me to bring back another. So, I'm putting the word out. If you see something in these woods, something that doesn't belong, you know where to find me.